Thanks, everyone. So, yeah, it is move-in day, so don't use knives downtown. Not a good idea. So, I'm Keegan Rodgers. I'm founder and pastry chef at the Lakehouse Bakery. We're towards the end of our 6th year in business now, but I've been in food for over 35 years. I started back when I was a wee youngin', long time ago, it feels like. But I love what I do, so it doesn't feel like that long ago. So I have a lot of different experience, and one of the things we're talking about is knives. You don't use too many in baking and pastries, but you'd be surprised because you really do. So what we're gonna, I love this quote because it's so true, and this is because I have fun, right? Like it's the joy of cooking and baking for me, and it is child's play, but it is also an absolute act of love, because food is my love language. What we're going to go over today, we're going to talk about knives, the parts of knives, and you'd be surprised how many parts to a knife there actually are. Types of knives, sharpening versus honing, what to do and what not to do. We'll talk about that a lot. Some basic culinary cuts, some buying tips, how to maintain your knives, because you don't have to buy really expensive ones, but you want to get the ones you've got and keep them. Some other culinary utensils, and then I'll demo a few things that I've got that I brought in, just ran to Kroger really quick and picked up a couple things that we're going to demo. As we're going, please stop and ask questions so that you're safe working at home with knives, because again, they are knives and they are sharp, so you do have to be very careful. So that's the main thing today. Be very respectful of your knives. It's an extension of your hand, and you really want to make sure that you keep all of your fingers because they're important. So handling knives with respect and handling them with care is crucial. You also want to make sure that you're keeping them sharp. It sounds weird, but a sharper knife is safer. A dull knife, unfortunately, you end up using more pressure, either on the downward stroke to slice, and chances are, because it's dull, it's not actually slicing through anything, and you'll end up cutting yourself or it coming off the board, and it's just way more dangerous. Keep your knives sharp, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. And use them safely. Use them for what they're designed for. These are not box openers. These are not things you got a package from Amazon. Don't use your kitchen knives for that. Use a pair of scissors for that. That's what that's designed for, or a box opener, right? Use them for safely, make sure they're not wet, make sure your hands are dry, make sure that you're being really conscious of what's going on. Use a proper cutting surface. One of my biggest pet peeves when I started working in kitchens was I'd see people just cut on a countertop. No, 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 no. For a variety of reasons, which you'll learn tonight. And then keeping them properly stored, and we'll talk a lot about that. And there's some misleading information out there, so hopefully we'll clear that up for you tonight as well. So, knife parts. Who knew there were this many? That's a lot of parts. So, the blade. So a blade can be either a full or a partial blade. It does need to be made of a high carbon steel. Ceramic is also a really great material for knives. They tend to be a bit more expensive, and unless you're a professional chef and willing to spend several $100s for a chef knife, you don't need it. For you at home, a high carbon stainless steel knife will be just fine. The ceramic ones last a really long time, but again, that's for they're way more expensive, and you don't really need that. The blade being full or partial, what I mean by that is how far back in the handle it goes. So on this knife, for example, it's got the 3 rivets. This tells us that it's a full tang, and that's what this is. So the tang is the rest of the blade that goes all the way through the handle. A partial blade only goes part of the way. So if you see a handle that only has like 2 rivets up here and none back here, chances are it's just a partial blade. Again, some of it is balance, some of it is comfort, some of it is price. It really doesn't necessarily matter which one you get. I find that full tang knives tend to be safer. They tend to be a bit more evenly balanced. So they're not that much more expensive, so it's worth the extra $10 or $15 to get a full tang on it. A handle, hard, non-porous, and comfortable. If you go somewhere to buy a knife and they won't let you play with it, don't buy them. You have to play with your knives. And I don't mean that like sword fighting. Like handle it. Put it in your hands. Feel it. They should also have something to cut or slice while you're there playing with it. If it doesn't feel comfortable in your hand, don't buy it. Because you'll end up getting blisters on your hands and it won't feel comfortable for you and you end up won't using it and it'll sit in a drawer somewhere and then collect dust. And that's not what this is for. It's to slice stuff. Carrots, potatoes, watermelon, whatever, right? So make sure you can fit it in your hand. You also want to make sure that when you're fitting it in your hand that it's not too big or too small. The exception to that is a paring knife, and those tend to be very small anyway, but we'll get to that. But if it feels really clunky or really big, don't get it. Make sense? All right, so then we've got rivets. The rivets should be steel. You can find some that are plastic, but those will warp, I've found, over use. So it should be a steel rivet, and it should be very similar to what you see there. So the bolster, this is the part, so if it's not a full tang, so if it's a partial tang, this will be a separate piece. So when they manufacture the knife, they'll have this over the handle, then they'll slide the knife through that. For ones that are a full tang, it's all one piece. And that's kind of a guard from the blade through to the handle. And that's really what it does. The spine, this is the back of the blade, and it can be very thick or thin. It doesn't matter. It just depends on the knife that you're using. And that's what it's for. It's the back of it. The tip is not the same as the point. The tip is the front 1/4 inch-ish of the knife. The tip is, of course, the pointy part, right? I mean, that's the part that you don't always use. And I'll explain that in a minute. The cutting edge is, of course, sometimes it depends on the knife, but sometimes it doesn't go all the way back to the bolster. Sometimes it comes about 1/4 inch forward, but it's the whole length from the point, typically back to the bolster, is the edge or the cutting edge of it. And then the butt is the very back of it. And sometimes it'll be kind of, that one's angled, sometimes it'll be rounded. It depends on the knife that you're using. It depends on the manufacturer. And that really, again, comes in with, when you handle it and play with it, which one you prefer. There's no right or wrong for this. It's just which one fits better in your hands. Any questions on the parts of a knife? All right. So when you're looking for a knife set for you at home, you really only need 3. You need a chef knife, you need a utility knife, and you need a paring knife. A bread knife is also really handy, and I'll talk about that in a second, but you really only need those 3. Knife blocks, we'll talk about in a second, tend to come with a bunch of things that you'll never use. Who's bought a knife block and had knives in it that they've never touched? Yeah, they gotcha. A French or a chef knife, this basic shape is the same. All 3, if you'll notice, the shape is about the same. The difference is the length of the blade. A chef knife is between 8 and 14 inches, and honestly, again, unless you're a professional chef, I'd stick somewhere between the 8 to 12 inch range. A 14-inch blade is really big. You don't realize how heavy that becomes, and unless you're going to use it for something very specific, like a watermelon that's really big, you're not really going to need that. 10 to 12 inches should be fine for at home. The utility knife is a smaller version of the chef knife, so it's just a little bit smaller. It gets into smaller things, so depending on what you're cutting, it's a little bit more maneuverable. You have a little bit more flexibility with it. And then, of course, a paring knife. Paring knives are like so indispensable in a kitchen. We've got a boning and a fillet knife. Now you'll notice that those are shaped also very similarly. The difference is whether it's flexible or not. The fillet knife is very flexible, whereas the boning knife is not. And you'll notice they're about the same length, And they're almost the same shape, but you'll notice this one kind of curves up, and this one is almost scimitar-ish in shape. And this is the fillet, that's the boning knife. And the boning knife is designed to get in around ribs, to get in and around, like if you've got a shank at a beef shank or a pork shank, that's what it's designed to get in and around. Where a fillet knife is after you've gotten it off the bone, what you do with it. Does that make sense? And then, of course, a bread knife. Bread knives are serrated. They look kind of like a saw. So they have a serrated edge on it. And you should never, ever, 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 ever try to slice bread with a straight blade. You're just going to mush it. And nobody likes mushy bread. You need the bread knife. It's designed that way for a reason. And when 1929, I think, was the year, somewhere around there, when the bread slicer was invented, it hasn't changed design. It still uses serrated blades. It's the best one for it. Now we've got a couple other knives that are specialty knives, a carver or a slicer. So anyone gone to a buffet and they've had prime rib, you see the guy standing there with the tall white hat, and he's got a knife very similar to this, and he's slicing off the prime rib. You'll notice on the side of it, there's little divots, so that it's generally for things that are thicker. So again, think prime rib, so that as it's slicing through, it doesn't create a vacuum and get stuck in the meat. It's so that it can continue to slice nice and evenly through. But notice there's no point on that one. And there doesn't need to be, because this is only for cooked meat. You'd never use a slicer for anything raw or any vegetable. It's only for a turkey, a prime rib, a chicken, a goose, a whole ham, things along those lines. And then a cleaver. A cleaver is, it's a specialty, it's heavy, and it's for chopping bones. It's for getting through the breast of a chicken. It's got the weight and heft that it needs to completely pull apart the chicken or turkey or whatever. The ribs, that's what it's for, is to go through and to slice through bone. Any questions so far on the types of knives? All right. Sharpening versus honing. This is critical information. Sharpening, because when you buy your knife, it will already be sharp. The edge will already be perfectly aligned and ready to go. Overuse, that edge will go away. That's natural. It's supposed to happen. You can mitigate how fast that happens by a couple things that we'll talk about tonight. But when it does happen, you need to get the edge back. Because again, dull knives are dangerous. So to do that, you need to use a sharpening stone. Honestly, it's best to have it professionally done, but you can totally watch some videos, get some books here from the library on how to sharpen a knife. Sharpening and honing are two completely different things, and under no circumstances do you get one of these little thingies and you run your knife through it. Any of those gimmicky things that they've got where you can just put your blade in it and run it through, drag it through, don't buy those. And we'll talk about why in a second. So when you're sharpening, you're realigning and re-edging the blade. And that's the whole point, is to get that edge back together and resharpen it. Now, honing, when you hone, what you're doing is you're aligning the micro grooves on the edge in the same direction. So that once it's sharpened, you hone before you use it, and then you hone after you use it so that the edge stays as long as possible to help keep that sharp. It's not the same. It's done on one of these guys. This is called a steel, and we'll talk about one of these in a minute. Make sure I covered everything. Abrades the edge, stones. Honing is not sharpening. All right, I think we got everything.
Does it include those electric kind of, you start it up and there's a rotary, and I'm not sure what it is inside there, and then you drag?
Yeah, it includes those. Don't do that. And I'll tell you why in a second. So if you're sharpening, you should be using something like this, some stones. And you notice the numbers on it? The numbers are the grit. So the higher the number, the grittier it is. The lower the, I may have it backwards. Yeah, I have it backwards. So the higher the number, the finer the grit. So you're going to start, just like sandpaper, with a lower number and work your way towards a higher number so that you have a smaller grit, so that you're sharpening it along the way. It can be done dry or wet. You could use a mineral oil to do that. It doesn't really matter, but that is the best way to do it. So what is this thing down here? It doesn't look like a stone. I'll talk about that in a second. And then steels. Now, we call them steels, but they could be ceramic, because if you have a ceramic blade, you want to use a ceramic steel. And again, it's more like super fine sandpaper, and it's, again, aligning the grooves on the edge. It's not actually sharpening anything. That's not what it does. With sharpening, it does take some practice to do this, because you have to have the right angle on the edge to sharpen it. If you don't have the right angle on the edge, you're just going to continue to dull it, and you'll completely lose your edge. So that's why it's really best to have a professional do it. But if you want to give it a shot, have some old knives at home and buy a couple of the stones. Sure, give it a shot. That way you're not using it on a brand new knife that you just spent. Yeah.
So my stone set actually has a positioning thing to hold them. Is the angle the same on all the blades?
No.
Oh, okay. No.
Yeah, the angle, it depends on the blade that you're using, because a slicing blade edge is going to be thinner and not as, the edge doesn't have to be as edged as, say, a chef knife, and it's certainly going to be a different edge than a cleaver. I'm assuming it's going to be at a pretty generic edge for most knives. So if it's a utility knife or a chef knife or a paring knife, something along those lines, chances are it would be fine. I wouldn't run a boning knife or a fillet knife through it. Did that help?
Yes.
All right. And you'll see, like on this blade, you can really see, like this thin part, that's the edge. So that's where you want to make sure that you've got the correct angle to get that edge and to keep that edge sharp. That make sense? All right, sharpening don'ts. I mentioned the things, right? So basically what you're doing with these is you're gouging off parts of the metal. Anybody used one of these and then looked underneath on the countertop and you see little bits of metal? You're completely just grating it across, like you're ripping off parts of the metal. You're not actually creating an edge. So that's why, again, using a stone is the best way to do it. Because once you start, ripping off metal, you've totally lost your edge. And you could probably, you're talking about might not be quite as elaborate as that one. But the problem with those is they go so fast, they create friction. And what does friction create? Heat. What happens to metal when it gets heated? It changes the molecular structure so that you're potentially completely denaturing and degrading the metal. And if you don't know what you're doing with one of those, and you go too much of an angle, you're completely losing, again, that edge, depending on the type of knife you're using, and you won't be able to get it back. So anything mechanical like that, absolutely don't do. Yeah?
I had a professional sharpen my knives once, and they used a grinding wheel. Is that something you can do to get a good one, or is that something I should not hire again?
That's a double-edged question. See what I did there? If they're experienced enough to know how much pressure to apply, because the issue is most people, and I've had companies that would come into a restaurant that I worked, and we contracted with them, and they would drop off the knives, and once a week they would bring new knives back, and it was just a constant. And I had one come back that, where's my paring knife? That they'd used a grinding edge, and this whole part of the blade was gone. And it looked like a prison shank. They like ground away part of the handle even. So if they're an experienced sharpener and they know what they're doing, I would say it's possible for them to use a grinding wheel and still be successful at getting that. If they're not, no, don't use them. You're just throwing bad money away. Like it's just not even going to be, because you're killing your edge. And again, the friction, you're heating the metal. If there's sparks flying from it, you're heating the edge. Did that help? Okay. So honing, again, is the micro alignment, or is the alignment of the micro grooves on the edge. Now, there's all kinds of steels out there, and the steel that I have, if you'll notice, I'm going to hold it up, and I don't know if you can see. See how the edge has angles to it? These are the proper angles to hold the blade. Not all steels have that. Some are just round. And I did this because I'm horrible at it. And I needed the extra training wheels, essentially, to help keep me on the edge the right way. And that's what you want to make sure that you're doing. So you see chefs on the TV shows and they're just whipping through. They've done it 7 bazillion times. Don't go that fast. They also like to hold them up and do that, right? I'm waiting for someone to take some knuckles off. It's okay to put it down on the countertop to hold it steady. No one says you have to do it up in the air. You are not Gordon Ramsay, right? So put it against the countertop and gently. And do one side and then do the other. One side and then the other. So that you're evenly honing it. Because that's the issue. Because what you can't really see on the TV is they're doing both sides. And I've tried to count, but I'm anal retentive about it, but I couldn't see because they're going so fast to make sure that it was an even number. Because they should be doing an even number so that both sides are getting honed. Does that make sense? Okay. Any questions on sharpening and honing? Yeah.
I've done honing, and I've always had trouble with it slipping, so I actually switched from using a board for the bottom to using a rubber pad.
Perfect. Yep, because you're exactly right. And that leads to all kinds of potential dangers with your knife. So I'm glad you found a way to hold it steady so that you could hone while you're working it. That's great. Yeah.
When you're honing, does the angle have to be exact like on a sharpening stone, or is there more leeway to it?
There's a little bit more leeway, but not much. Because the idea is to align the grooves on the edge. And if you're not getting the edge, you're not getting those grooves aligned. So there's a little bit, but a little bit. Yeah.
2 questions.
Yeah.
Do you ever hone a bread knife?
No.
Okay. And how often should you hone versus sharpen?
Every time you use it.
Every time you should hone it?
Yep. Every time you use the blade, you should hone it. So just get in the habit. You grab it from your knife kit or wherever you're storing it, and we'll talk about that in a second. Hone really quick, wipe it off, go to work. And then properly store. And I think that's what we're going to talk. Oh, I have one more thing before this, but then we're going to talk about storage. Any other questions on sharpening versus honing?
I get the inclination to want to rinse it off after doing that, because in my mind, for some reason, I feel like the little particles or something.
That's why once you've honed, just wipe it off and you're good to go. Because again, you're not taking anything away from the blade. You're actually just aligning those micro grooves. So if it's a clean knife in a clean steel, there should be nothing on there afterwards. There's no residue, there's no debris, because you're not taking anything away. You're just aligning those grooves. Make sense? All right. What the heck is a strop? So that thing I showed down here. So a strop, because we've seen in the movies where people that are barbers will go to a leather thing, they've got it attached to the wall, and they go back and forth, and then they go to shave somebody. A strop is a piece of leather that's abraded, that has a rough edge to it, and it polishes the edge. So it's really the final step in the sharpening process. And you don't have to do it because it's a polishing thing, and typically you'll only do that for razors or things that are razor edged. Some sushi knives are razor edged. There are some very few kitchen knives. It's more for very specialty things that you would use a strop for. But that's what it is, and that's why sometimes if you'll buy a knife sharpening kit, there might be a strop in there. But that's what it is, so that when they back and forth really quick, they're polishing the edge so it stays nice and sharp, and then they go shave somebody or make some sushi and really thin cuts, or yeah, we don't want to go there. Yeah.
So it is sharpening, it's not just like aesthetics?
It's
Micro-honing?
yes, it's like that's a really good way to put it, micro honing, because it's polishing the edge, because it's leather, right? There's nothing. It's different abraded sides of leather that you can take a wire brush and because you could use it over and over and over and over. And if it starts to look black or really shiny, you can take a wire brush and kind of brush gently over the leather, and then continue to use that to strop. So it's really just a polishing final step to kind of keep the edge in, so that once you start using it and honing it, the edge will stay a little bit longer. It's completely not necessary. And again, typically only for blades that are razor sharp, which your kitchen knives should not be razor sharp. They'll be sharp, but not that sharp. Does that make sense? All right. So knife buying tips. My number one tip, do not under any circumstances buy knife blocks. We've already touched on one reason, because there's things in there that you will never use. The other reason is every time you put a knife in and take the knife out, you're dulling the blade. And someone said, well, turn them around. You're still dulling the blade every single time. And I gotta know, I just can't believe it's anything other than gross down in the middle of that little, because knife blocks sit on the countertop and there's stuff flying everywhere, and it's going to get gross down in there. So you're putting a clean knife in a really gross, empty hole that's dulling it every time you use it. Don't buy knife blocks. They're expensive. They're not worth it. They're killing your knives. Just don't do it. Buy the best you can afford. Now, the knife I have up there showing that knife right there. Take a wild guess how much that one is. It's a kitchen knife. It's a sashimi knife. Just ballpark guess it. No.
500.
Higher.
1,000.
Higher.
3,000.
$6,500. Amazon. Not kidding. I double checked it. Almost $7,000 for that one knife.
What kind of knife?
I'm sorry?
Which style of knife?
Oh, that's a sashimi knife.
Did you cut with it or frame it?
Yeah, I wouldn't do either, because I own a small business, man. Are you kidding me? $6,000 for a knife? It does happen to be hand-forged Damascus steel, so it's really a work of art. But $6,000, so don't buy that, right? Don't go there. On average, most knives that you should have in your home are going to be about $100. So I don't want anyone to think Chef Keegan said, go buy the $6,000 knife. That is not what I'm saying. Invest in the best that you can afford. And when you can afford a better knife, invest in a better knife. If you take care of it properly, it will last you a very, very, very long time. But again, a paring knife is not going to be as expensive as a 12-inch chef knife. On average, a 12-inch chef knife is going to be about $100, maybe $120, depending on the brand and where you buy it from. Last, a salad knife. I hate these things. Salad knives are horrible. First of all, it's a piece of plastic. Sometimes they're metal, but it's just a cheap piece of metal or a cheap piece of plastic that as you're cutting into your lettuce actually breaks down the cell structure of your lettuce and makes it brown faster. Tear it. Just tear your lettuce. You don't need a knife for lettuce because it's lettuce. It's a gimmick that people have sold you on. Don't do it. Don't fall into that trap. That's off my soapbox now. Sorry about that. All right, so I mentioned buy the best you can afford, and if you take care of it, it will last a really, really long time. Store it properly. Every one of my knives has a sheath. Every one of them. I've got a variety over here. And when I'm done, it goes in its sheath, and then it goes into my knife kit. And when they're not in my knife kit and we're using it, it gets stored on a magnetic strip. Not in a drawer. It gets washed by hand, not a dishwasher. Because again, chemicals can impact the metal. Especially, I mean, if you spend $100 on a knife, you want to keep that little thing, right? Like you want it for a while. Don't add bleach to it. Don't add the harsh chemicals that are in your dishwasher. The heat sometimes alone from the dishwasher could be enough over time to impact the metallurgy on that blade. Hand wash, dry it, put it on a magnetic strip. Done. And it's a really pretty thing in your kitchen, right? You get a couple of really good knives. It's an eye-appealing thing. Sharpen annually. Yeah.
Sorry.
No worries.
Is there a preference between the sheath or the magnetic strip? I think you said while you're using it.
Yeah, so I have a whole set of knives back at the bakery that are on a magnetic strip right now. And we have one in the house for the knives that we use in the house. But these are my special knives, so these stay in their sheath in my knife kit. So the ones that I'm using every day, all day, stay on a magnetic strip.
You talk about a knife kit as opposed to a knife drawer. Can you clarify?
Yep, so this is my knife kit. I got it in pastry school, and it has a place for every knife. So that once it's in its sheath, I can put it in and keep it organized so that everything goes in it nice and neat. Nothing gets banged up. The edges stay nice and sharp because they're protected in their sheath, and they stay nice and clean. So this is my knife kit. Now, this is a pretty big one, right? Like there are some that it's you don't have to get this big. There are some knife kits that you can get that it's a piece of it's like a piece of canvas that has a spot for everything, and then you roll it up. That works just as well because it's organized and it's keeping it clean and it's keeping the blade covered with the sheath.
We have a mag bar on the side of the cabinet and everything's up there, but it's open, it's not in a sheath, it's exposed to air and anything. Is there any
That's fine.
considerations?
Nope.
Just you talking about all the debris going on there, you should probably wipe it before using it.
Absolutely, but yeah. Yep, so that's why ours is in our dish area so that when we're done washing everything by hand, it goes right on the magnetic strip. Yep. They're cheap, right? They're super cheap to get, they're easy to install, and they work really, really well. Sharpen annually. Professionally, for you guys at home, about once a year is right. If you're a professional chef, it should probably be monthly because you use it so often. You're really using that edge down, so it should be done monthly if you're professional. But if for you guys at home, once a year is fine. And when you go somewhere, there's a couple places that do it, ask how they do it. If they're using a wheel and it's just a general hardware store, maybe not. If it's a professional knife sharpening company, chances are they know what the heck they're doing because they do it for a living. And they're going to be respectful of your knives and take care of it because they want your business. So once a year.
What kind of cost do you expect?
It depends on the company, but on average, $6 to $10 per blade. If it's over $10, don't do it.
Is there a place you'd recommend around here?
I have used the Roaming Stone.
Where is that?
It's called the Roaming Stone, so they actually will come to you. You can set up an appointment, and they, again, we're out in the middle of nowhere, Chelsea, and they've come to us. And they do a good job. And we have them come out once a year. Twice a year, really, because we don't use our knives as much as a professional chef does doing onions every day, but we have them at least once a year.
So professional chefs don't.
No, they should do it monthly. And that's why a lot of,
They don't. They
yep.
don't do it.
Yeah, professional chef typically will have it done monthly.
They're saying they don't do it themselves. even as-
Typically, no. Typically, they'll have, if they're like really into it, some will.
Okay.
It depends on, like, some people like to do that, some people don't. So if they like to do it, then yeah, they'll do it themselves. Yep. And then I mentioned this at the beginning. Only use a cutting board. Please, it's not a box opener. It's not to like anything. Don't cut anything else on anything else. Use a cutting board. Now let's talk about cutting boards for a second. Most cutting boards you're going to find now are polycarbonate. Some older ones are going to be wood. The problem with wood for us as professionals is it's porous. You use the same cutting board over time, you find that you've got these slices in your cutting board. They actually sell, it's called a cutting board resurfacer, and it scrapes the 1/4 inch off or so of the cutting board so that you have a fresh, clean, and that's even for the polycarbonate ones. The health department doesn't like wood cutting boards in a commercial kitchen because they're porous and they can't really be sanitized very easily. But for you guys at home, as long as there's no visible cuts into the wood, a wood cutting board is fine. If you've got a butcher block cutting board, those things are gorgeous. It will last, it will work for what you're going to do. If you start to see anything on there like it's starting to get fuzzy, and you'll know what I mean, because if you're cutting onions in the same spot, it'll start to get this fuzzy look to it, right? Where the wood is starting to be cut. It might be time to sand it down and get a fresh new layer on once you've sealed it with mineral oil, food grade mineral oil. But that's the beauty in a wood cutting board, is you can sand that sucker down, put some mineral oil on it once it's cleaned, and then keep using it as long as it's thick enough. If you get down where it's kind of thin, then get a new one. But only use a cutting board for your knives. The one I've got today is just a basic, small, we have 7 of these because they're really easy to use, and they clean up really well. We can, bleach water, sanitize them. They're great. One of my favorite days when I was in culinary school at Schoolcraft was when they were, when I'd walk by the charcuterie class, and they were sanitizing the butcher block tables, because there'd be about 1/2 inch of salt on top of the cutting boards and all the butcher block, because salt kills bacteria, and they were sanitizing the butcher block without chemicals, and then they'd let it sit for 24 hours, take the salt off, wipe it off, boom, ready to go. It was great. Any questions so far? Yeah.
Just a comment, there are those bamboo-like boards, but they're really just a lot of epoxy, and they're really hard on knives, is my experience.
They really are. That's why, I know they're sold as cutting boards, but wood and the poly are the best way to go. They'll protect your knives, they'll protect your edge, so it's not as hard on it. That's a really good point. I'm glad you brought that up.
What kind of wood?
A hardwood, oak, maple, yep. Maple, oak's going to be really expensive. Maple, not so much. So again, the best you can afford.
Oak is toxic, isn't
Is it backwards?
I think oak is toxic. Yes.
I'm not sure. Maple's the best one to go with. It's also the same material they use to make rolling pins. Yeah. Yeah.
And any particular, I guess, wash, chemicals that you would wash to avoid, or, like, I mean, say Dawn Power Wash, pretty potent stuff like that, would you say avoid?
I would use just a standard Dawn dish liquid. Any standard dish, but don't put it in your dishwasher, because that's going to be the harsh chemicals and the extra heat. So hand washing, just a mild soap, and then every week or so, 9 to 1 parts bleach water.
You can bleach, or you
Yep, 9
Yeah.
parts water.
Yep, 9 parts water to 1 part bleach.
every week?
I'd say if you're using it a lot, if you're not using your cutting board a whole lot, once a month.
Oh, you're talking about the cutting board, sorry, I was talking about the knife.
Oh, yeah, sorry. Yeah, the knives themselves, no, I would avoid bleach. Just a mild soap is fine. Yep. Anything else? All right. Other common utensils, a peeler, which you don't think about a peeler really being a knife, but it is. It's got a blade. It's got 2. A zester and a microplane, and I'll show you some of these in a minute. A mandolin or a Japanese mandolin. Now, I've never had luck using these. I always end up scraping my knuckles off, even with the little thing, but this is a mandolin. And it makes some different interesting cuts of vegetables. And practice really is what you need to use with that. But if you practice with your knife, you can do with your knife what a mandolin can do. Anyway, a baller or a Parisian scoop, and kitchen shears. Now, the nice thing about kitchen shears, and I've got my pair here, is this is, cutting through all kinds of stuff. But what's really nice is they come completely apart, and they are designed to do that for easy cleaning. So that you can clean and sanitize the chicken grossness off of this. And then just align it back up. And then kitchen shears. Don't cut paper with these. This isn't for crafts. And this, what is this for? This middle part is for seafood. Think crabs, some bones you can get in there and bend and kind of crack it. But this is for chicken, smaller kind of bones that you don't necessarily want to use your knife for. So a Parisian scoop. This is a Parisian scoop, and you'll notice it's got holes in the end of the scoop, so it doesn't create a vacuum, and so that it comes right back out. And I'll show you. I'm going to use this in a minute. Show you what to do with that. Zester micro. I'm sorry.
What do you think of the Kroger's? Always has these scissors all around there. It's a serrated edge, but I didn't know what you thought about it.
Oh, I don't think I've seen it.
Okay.
Yeah. Microplane. So a microplane zester can come in a couple of forms. And notice I have a sheath for both of those too. I like this one because it's got a handle. But essentially, this is like a rasp, if anybody knows woodworking. And it's for zesting lemons, oranges, key limes, things along that nature. I forgot to bring my garnishing kit, which has another type of zester on there. But this is going to be the most common that you'd find, and this is going to be the most versatile for you in the kitchen as well. The other thing that's really nice about using these is you can take the sheath and turn it upside down, and then zest your garlic on here, and you've got something to catch it, so that you've caught all of your garlic, and then use that to put it in whatever you're... So instead of mincing the garlic, and we'll talk about what that is in a second, you can use a microplane to get the same results a little bit neater. I love my microplanes. They're awesome. This is the other zester that I was talking about. So notice the holes on that. What that will do is when you go across the lemon peel or the orange peel, it will create long, thin strips of just the zest. So it's kind of nice. The Sanctu and sashimi knives, those are very specific for sushi. That's this one and this one, but notice it's got the same kind of divots that the slicer has, because that's for, if you think about raw tuna, the steaks are fairly thick, so it's the same concept as the roasted meat. So, but that's typically the one you'd use for raw sushi or any thick raw fish. A cheese knife and an oyster knife, those are both can be very dangerous. So this is the cheese knife and this is the oyster blade. The oyster blade is really difficult to use because it's got oyster juice all over it by the third one. And that makes it slippery. Typically, if you're going to use an oyster blade and you're shucking your own oysters, you would also have a mesh glove on your hand or some sort of protecting, like a thick leather, if nothing else, so that when you go in to shuck that oyster, you're going to come off one too many, it's going to slip, and that way you're not impaling your hand with the oyster blade. The metal mesh ones are nice. They're like $30, so they're not terribly expensive, but unless you're shucking a lot of oysters, you don't really need one. Sometimes you'll see people use just like an extra like folded up towel on their hand to kind of hold the oyster and then kind of pry it open that way. It works as long as your hand is protected. And then the cheese knife, now this is one specifically for hard cheeses, think Parmesan. So that you kind of, it will work for cheddar as well, but think a large block of it so that you kind of use that to dig in and then wedge open. It's not for necessarily just slicing cubes of cheese. You'd use a chef knife or a utility knife for that, but that's for breaking it from a large piece into a smaller one to then use as you need. Yeah?
The Santoku style knife is used as a general purpose chef knife in some parts of the world. And I've seen some like hybrid style that are somewhat halfway between those and the like German or French. What's your opinion on various shapes of general purpose knife?
Being a pastry chef, I don't really have one. Because for me, I'm not using it every day as a professional chef. I wouldn't necessarily use it to do onions. It's also going to be a bit pricier because of the shape and what it's designed for. I think if you're comfortable using it and you like using it, go for it. So yeah, I think it's a great idea. I mean, why not? Any other questions on other cutting utensils? Yeah?
I've seen a lot of the cylinder, and you either do the punch cuts or you do the twist, and it goes through like helical knives and everything. What's your opinion on those?
I think they're gimmicks.
Because you can, if you're skilled enough, you can do what they do.
Yep. Yep, and honestly, depending on, why you're doing it, like if you're making zucchini noodles, it's fun to do that and it works. So if you're vegan and you want some kind of like a spaghetti dinner and you want use the zucchini or the squash instead, sure. But for the most part, I think it's gimmicky. All right, so common knife cuts. This is going to get you through most recipes. If it's anything other than these, chances are you should just go to the restaurant and get it. But for the most part, this is going to get you through most recipes to get pretty much anything done. Chop is exactly what it sounds like. So let's say it's celery. Take the ends off, uniformly chop. Now, chopping is a little bit larger than an inch, so it's 1 inch to 2 inches depending on what you're using it for. If you're using it to make a vegetable stock, it doesn't really matter. If you're using it to make a salad or a sauce of some sort, the size does matter. If you're using it for, say, pot pie filling, it matters. Because if you've cut uneven pieces, it will cook unevenly. So by the time the bigger pieces are done, the smaller pieces are way done. And the reverse. The smaller pieces are done and you think, oh great, I got a small one, it's done. The bigger pieces probably aren't. So that's why uniform cuts are really important. It's not just because we're being persnickety, it's because it's cooking is chemistry, and it matters in the final product. And it matters in texture and taste and doneness. So rough chop is generally 1 inch to 2 inches-ish. Then we've got dice. And notice the sizes, small, medium, and large. We're talking 1/4 to 3/4 of an inch. That's tiny. It gets even tinier with the mince. Mincing is typically done with dry, fresh herbs or spices. Some spices that are larger, think star anise. But for a mince, think basil. Especially now, I love basil. Dill. Right, you see where I'm going with that. So there's an offshoot of the mince called a chiffonade, where you take leaves of basil and layer them, roll them up, and slice, and they come out as long, thin strips. You don't have to do that, right? You could just mince them. It will still taste really good. It's more of a presentation kind of a thing. And then we've got a julienne and a bâtonnet. And I bet everyone in this room has had a bâtonnet. Who's ever had a French fry? That's a bâtonnet. Julienne is typically smaller in scale. A bâtonnet is the same basic square shape. It's just longer. And they can vary in, so basically what you do is they vary in the same sizes as the dice. So a julienne would be a small dice, long, where a bâtonnet would be a large dice, long. Because to think about a French fry, that's about a 3/4 of an inch round, or square thing that's nice and long. So you've got, with these cuts, you can do a variety of things with it, and that's kind of the idea. Any questions on the cuts? All right, so now we're going to go to how-to. I'm going to demonstrate how to do a couple of these. I'm going to start, let me put some gloves on. The other thing I want you to notice as I'm doing this is I'm using it's called a bench blade. It doesn't actually have an edge on it, but what it does is it allows me to pick things up that I've diced and cut without using my knife. That's this guy. Do not use your knife as a scoop. It's not a scoop. This is. So if you've got whatever it is you're dicing and you do this, you're dulling the blade. So I'm going to do a really quick hone on this. And again, I'm going to go down and see I'm using, I don't know if you can see, let me come in. See the angle on that? I'm going to use that angle. And I'm just going to come down. And then I'm going to switch hands and do the other side. And I'm not going really fast. But I'm using this edge to get the correct angle. Not a right angle, because that's 90 degrees. See what I did there? The angle. Anyway.
So you don't have to alternate every other side, you can do the same number on each side?
As long as it's the same number on each side, absolutely. Because it's hard you can't do both sides this way, because you'd have to come back up. So that's why I'm making sure that I did 5, and then I come back on this side.
The angle of the edge of that steel is guiding your...
Yeah, this angle is the correct angle to use to make sure that the edge stays the same.
Is that for like a 15-degree knife, or is that for everything?
That's a 15 degree. So that's why I really like this one, because again, this is not my greatest skill. I'm really much better at chocolate chip cookies. But that's why I use this one, and I made sure to find one that had that so that I had the training wheels. All right, so I've got my cutting board. Now one thing I want to talk about really quick, I'm going to move this. See what I've got there? My cutting board is not going to move. You need to secure your cutting board to the surface. Now, I don't care what it is, you can use one of these guys, they're cheap. It's a roll of like 50 feet for like $5 at the dollar store.
Liner stuff?
Yep, it's shelf liner. That's all it is. And this is what it's designed for. And you can see, like I'm moving the table before I move the cutting board. I want to make sure that the cutting board is secured to the table. Sometimes if you don't have something like that, you can take a fairly thick paper towel, get it wet, and put it underneath and create a vacuum so that it secures it to the countertop. But you just don't want your cutting board sliding around everywhere, especially if whatever you're using, like when we get to the tomato, is really wet and there's lots of juice, because that's going to come up underneath and make it slippery, and that's dangerous. Make sense? All right, so I'm going to start with a potato. So I've got my potato, I've got my peeler, I've got two different kinds of peelers. It's really, I don't know if you can see that really well, it's really your preference, whichever one you prefer. Doesn't really matter. I've got a container for all of my stuff that I'm peeling and cutting off. And just, you don't want to take too much off, right? You just want to take a little bit off. I'm just applying a little bit of pressure.
Can you sharpen or peel it?
No.
Are they just sort of done once they're built?
Yep. When you can't peel anything anymore, get a new one. Because if you look at the way the blade's set up, there's no way to sharpen that. There's no way to keep that edge sharp.
Done it with a drill.
Yep. Oh, have you?
Yeah.
And notice, I'll pick up a piece. Notice how thin that is? Because I want the potato. I mean, the peel's just as good for you, right? It has the nutrients in it as well. But if whatever I'm making, mashed potatoes or potato salad, and I don't want the skin on it, I'm not applying so much pressure that it makes it thick. And you shouldn't anyway, because this blade is so thin. So you just want enough to take off what you need. And it doesn't matter how big or small the pieces are, as long as it's a nice thin piece and it comes off pretty easy.
You don't do the ice first.
No, you can, like if you wanted to, and this one has a digger to get in there, but honestly, I'll just go through and do a little bit more on that one spot so that I save, because food is not getting cheap anymore, right? Like, I want to use the whole potato. The other thing for me is it's food cost. So the less waste I have, the more profit I have, right? So I want to keep it. So again, I don't want to use my knife to scrape. I'm just going to set that to the side. And now I'm going to cut. Now, I didn't completely peel this. I didn't really need to. You guys get the idea of a peeler. When you're slicing, and I think I'm going to go this way, typically, you come down and you'll use, I don't know if you can see, you'll use the shape of the blade. Don't just start hacking into it. You could, but you want to use the shape of the blade to slice into it. And notice, maybe we need to go sideways. Can you guys see how I'm doing that? How I'm starting here and I'm using the shape of the blade.
It's hard to see.
And I love raw potato. So what I'm doing is I'm starting here and I'm using the surface, I'm following the shape of the blade to slice through it. I'm not chopping through this way. If I were chopping, that would be, but I'm slicing through. So I'm using the shape of the blade. Does that make sense? And then let's say I want to do, so if I'm making home fries, and notice very small motions, and there's not a whole lot of noise. You should not, I'm going to grab a knife that I don't want to do it with this one. You shouldn't really hear, like if you're making that much noise, you're doing it wrong. Because when you're slicing, I don't know if you could hear, there's not much noise to it. And again, because this is really sharp, it's easily slicing through. That's the whole point, is to slice. And if I were wanting to use this to dice, I would use, and also, I don't know if you can tell by my fingers, my fingers are curled back so that I'm using my knuckle as a guide, because it's flat. I don't know if you can see that that's flat. And this is helping me hold in, so I'm doing this. So that the blade comes here, so that my fingertips are never in jeopardy. Does that make sense? So this comes with practice. So if you're going to do a dice, and the potato is going to want to stick to the knife because it's wet. And then I'll take a stack of, 3 or so. And again, same motion. And again, the chefs on the shows, they've done this for so many years that it just comes naturally to them. And then I'll turn it. And there's my dice. And then I will put my knife down, and then I will grab, so that I'm using this to scoop things up, and not the blade. I think I dropped some potato. Yeah?
One thing that I've struggled with is when you've got like something you're working with and a blade in your hands, it's hard to see exactly where the blade is if you want to do a very small or precise cut. What do you do to be able to like actually see what's going on when there's like food stuck to it and it's on the knife? And...
Yeah, get a smaller knife.
Okay. That makes sense.
Because if you're trying to do a really fine dice with this, you're never going to do it. But you can do a really fine dice with this, so that you can clearly see what you're doing. And again, use the shape of the blade. Don't do, not this. Notice I didn't even touch the cutting board with it, because that's going to dull your edge. Because what you're doing when you chop like that, you're absolutely just hard surfacing that fine point edge, and it's going to curl. So that's why you want to use the slicing motion. But yeah, get a smaller blade. And practice. Make lots of veg stock. I mean, winter's coming, right? Veg stock is awesome for a soup base for so many things. Make some, just practice knife cuts with this one's still a little bit bigger, but you get the idea. Just use a smaller knife so you have more control. In pastries, it's all about control. And when you're using a knife, it's all about control. Make sense? All right, I don't want to leave my knife dirty. So I'm done with the potato. And as I'm wiping, notice I'm coming from behind. And I'm not coming this way through it, right? If necessary, do one of these guys, right? That totally works. And then since this is sanitized, I'm just going to let that air dry. I don't need to, if I wipe that off, I've just recontaminated it.
Do you do anything to prop the knife up?
Nope. It's fine just like that. All right, so that's potato. So let's do an apple. So apples are amazing. I love apples. This is an apple corer. So the idea is this sits over the top of the core, and you push through, and you get all the seeds out. I saw that. Maybe, right? Sometimes you do it, sometimes you don't. What's nice about this one is it has a release so that the core can come out nice and even, but I'm going to show you a better way. You're going to take your apple. If you want, you can peel your apple. I love apple peel. And again, I'm not putting a lot of pressure because I want as much of the apple as I can possibly have. And I don't expect y'all to be able to do this, but I've peeled thousands of apples. And I can normally do it in one long, solid piece. Don't worry about the stickers, those are actually edible. Yeah, they're designed to be edible because they assume people won't take them off. So yeah, I mean, I got most of it, but for the most part, you can peel an entire apple and then eat this. This is really good, and it's good for you. So we've got our apple. I'm going to take my blade. I'm going to cut through the center. Then I'm going to take my melon baller, and I'm going to gauge the size that I need. And notice I'm putting it right over the seeds. And then same thing, I'm just going to, because I don't want the stem, and I don't want the end. And now I have all of the apple and none of the seeds. Because there's that membrane around the seeds that's not very pleasant to eat, is it? And then from here, I can do whatever I want with my apple. And I'm actually going to eat this on my way home. But you get where I'm going. Like, you could slice it, you could dice it, you could bake it just like this. You could put some brown sugar and cinnamon with some walnuts and some mace and butter and bake it. Like, now I'm hungry. But you right? But look how much cleaner that is, and you get all of the apple. Because again, I'm a small business owner, and I want as much of the apple as I can get. So I'm going to put my apple in there. Again, I'm going to wipe off my blade.
You don't like the board?
We can, yes, and I probably should, but none of this is going to be consumed by anyone other than me. So I'm not worried about cross-contamination. If you're using something that would be a cross-contamination issue, like chicken, absolutely. In fact, you should have a different cutting board for meat, seafood, cheese, vegetables, especially onions, because the onion juice will seep into it. Yeah. All right, so speaking of onions, here's our onion. All right, this is dry now. So same basic thing. So there's a couple ways to do onions. You could take off one end and again slice through. Slice through. Now, depending on what you want to do, like if you're making onion rings, just keep slicing. If you're going to dice, you want to take off a little bit. You just want to get, like, score it essentially and get the skin off. I didn't even go through that second layer. I mean, I kind of did. Let me see. Yep, I went through just enough to get just that second layer of onion off. It depends. Sometimes you can use it if you're making vegetable stock, sure. But sometimes they're varying thicknesses, so it might still have some peel on it, especially red onions. That tends to be the case with red onions. So a lot of times you'll see people will go through and they'll make a bunch of slices this way, then they'll turn it and they'll do a bunch of slices this way, and then they'll turn it this way to dice it. Has anybody seen that before? It kind of works. The easiest way is to, you've got a flat surface, slice through, set aside. Now you've got something smaller and more controllable that's easier to work with. And again, see how I'm letting the blade slice through? Now, when it gets to the point that it's a little bit harder to hold, turn it on its side so you have a little bit more surface area. And then keep slicing. And there's my dice. Because it naturally is going to fall apart from the rings when you dice it. You grab. And since I'm eating my apple, I don't want to put onions on it. And then for this one, you could do, again, you could do the same thing. The same dice. You could go larger. It just depends on what your final product is going to be and what the recipe calls for. This would be considered a chop. But notice again, I didn't really make that chop noise because you shouldn't be making too much noise. Here's a rough chop. And again, this would be really great for a soup stock or sauteing with some mushrooms to go on a steak or, you know. I'm not a big fan of onions. Actually, yeah, I've done an onion sablé. So I cut up the onions and sautéed them in butter for several hours, then pulled the butter off and used that to make a shortbread crust for an onion tart. Yeah.
Now we're hungry.
And I want to wipe off my blade.
Is that just soapy water you use?
This is actually sanitized water. Because no, it's a quaternary sanitizer. Sanitabs, multi-purpose sanitizing. Ammonium chloride dihydrate. And that's what we have to have in the kitchen at the bakery, in all kitchens, some kind of a sanitizer to keep everything clean. All right, so next we're going to go with a tomato. Now there is a little thing that you can get to like core out the part from your here. It's a little raspy thing, and that works pretty well. That's probably one of the few gimmick thingies that I will work with because it just gets that. But again, honestly, you don't really need it. If your knife is sharp enough, just slice right through. If you're making them for burgers, who cares, right? They can be all kinds of thicknesses. When you get to the end, this is thicker than it normally would be. Just cut around it. If you're cutting for a salad, doesn't really matter. And then just pitch that one. So you've got, again, let's say you're making guacamole. This is a little bit wetter, but because my knife is nice and sharp, it's able to go through the skin. Because that's the part that everybody gets stuck on, is the skin. And if your blade is sharp enough, it will easily slice right through.
That chef or utility knife, but it has those same divots that was on the slicer. Is that recommended or is it?
Yeah, because again, for the same reason, so it doesn't create a vacuum, and it actually helps release the tomato so that when you slice through, it doesn't stay on it. Because if you notice with the potato, it kind of stuck to the blade. It won't do that with this because of the divots.
Is it called a divot? Is that the official name?
I believe it is. And if you're, while you're practicing and getting comfortable with it, there's no one that says that you can't just flip it over. Especially if you're making like guacamole. And again, notice that my blade is mostly not coming off of the cutting board, and I'm using the shape of the blade to do the cutting for me. Let me grab another container, because tomatoes and apples don't go together very well either.
Do you use any ceramic knives yourself?
I don't. I can't afford them. They're kind of expensive. But they do, they last a really long time, and they retain their edge really well.
Is there a difference in sharpening than?
Yeah, it's a completely different animal because of the surface that it is, which is why if you have, sorry, I don't want to talk down, if you have a ceramic knife, you need a ceramic steel. It's still called a steel, even though it's not steel, but you'd need one specifically for ceramic blades so that you don't damage it. And let me wipe this guy off. And then it's I can't believe it, it's almost fall. Acorn squash, these things are hard. Like, how the heck do you get into this thing? Same way. And I do prefer these for this, for that reason, so that when you're cutting through, it's a bit firmer, of course. And I'm applying a little bit more pressure. Now, I don't want to cut through that part because it'll dull my blade. So I cracked it open. But you can see how smooth the edge is. So same basic concept. It's a little bit firmer, but I just want to make sure that I go through all of it. The one thing that I struggle with, and most people that aren't professional chefs struggle with, is making sure that the knife stays straight up and down. Because if you'll notice, this has a little bit of an angle to it. And that's what I struggle with, is keeping it from doing this. And that's just practice.
You don't take the seat down?
Oh, you would. I was just showing how to cut through. Yeah, but normally, and I love acorn squash, normally you would. But I'm thinking other hard fall veg. Patty pan squash, rutabaga, parsnips, carrots, things along those lines that are a bit firmer. And notice that it goes through the seeds, and I'm not really taking the blade off of the cutting board.
You're anchoring the tip?
Yep. So that I have much more control over my movements. And notice my movements were really small and in. I wasn't all wild and crazy. I was being really controlled and using small motions. And really, it's more my shoulder if you look. It's some of my wrist, but also notice how I'm holding the blade. It's a little weird back here for me, so I come up a little bit more so I have more control, so that I'm using that slicing motion instead of a chopping motion. And then garlic, because everybody loves garlic. I'm gonna, that one's getting kind of full. In roasted acorn squash or roasted patty pan squash, so good. All right, let me wipe that guy off. So garlic, I'll show you garlic really quick. Now, a lot of people will get their garlic cloves and they'll start pulling them apart, and then they'll take their blade and they'll go smash. Don't do that. It's pretty easy to peel garlic. There is another gimmick. It's a little piece of silicone. It's a tube that you put the garlic clove in, and you roll it, and then boom, it comes out. They work really well, but honestly, it didn't take me that long to peel that. You kind of crack the end.
So you recommend just crushing it with your fingers?
Yep, and I'm not really crushing the clove. I'm kind of popping the end so that the outer shell or the outer membrane kind of comes loose. It's also a little bit more difficult with gloves on, but I don't want to smell like garlic all night long.
Why not?
Well, it would go with the onions. And my girlfriend already thinks I'm part vampire, so that could be an issue. But yeah, it doesn't take very long to do that, and I will show you the microplane. And you can buy the garlic pre-peeled, but why?
Doesn't last very long.
It really doesn't. So I'm going to show you with my microplane. So this way is nice and smooth. This way is not. So the hasps or the rasps on it kind of go that way. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take it and I'm just going to and there I have perfectly minced garlic.
How do you get the last part of it?
The last part of it you got to be really careful with to get it, but you can. Just got to be a little bit more control, a little bit slower.
You got to put something between your fingers.
You could, because you'll take your fingertips off if you don't. But there's some awesome fresh garlic, and that's going to go right in here. And then last but not least, we've got bread. And I'm going to take my gloves off because they've got garlic and onion on them. Let me put those in here, and let me give this a good wipe. Now, if I've got some bread, hang on, I have another towel. I need to dry my hands for a second because my hands are wet. So with bread, again, if you use this, you're gonna crush the bread more than anything else, which is why you need a bread knife, because you'll saw through it. Because that's why it's serrated like that. The edge is essentially a saw. And it could be as thick or thin as you want, but you have a nice clean edge. And then you just saw through it. The only problem with bread knives like this is you can't sharpen them. So don't buy a really expensive one.
So you have the file to do this.
Can't do it. Because each one, there's only an edge on one side, and it's very difficult to get each one of those little individual edges perfectly aligned. And you cannot hone this for that same reason. So bread knives should only ever be used for bread. Nothing else. Don't use it for tomatoes. I know you're tempted. Don't do it. Bread. Because you can't hone it. You can't sharpen it. So get a little bit less expensive one that you know in 5 or so years you'll have to replace. But with the rest of these knives, they'll last 10, 15, 20 years if you take care of them. And I think that covers everything that I had for demo. So I think, let's go back to the presentation, please. Dum-da-dum. We're a little bit later. Okay, any questions? You know all about knives now, don't you? Perfect. Yeah.
Hold a steel knife on a
Not very well. But you could. It would just take a little bit longer and a little bit more effort. And it's really not worth it. So ceramic for ceramic, steel for steel.
And do ceramic knives need sharpening as well, or do you just?
Yes. Yep.
And how do you sharpen ceramic knives?
It's the same basic way, but you'd use smaller grits because the ceramic edge is a finer edge. But it's the same basic concept. Yep. And those, I mean, I would have those professionally done because they're, like I said, they're a bit more expensive. And they can last a little bit longer. They're also absolutely do not dishwash those. Like those should not go in a dishwasher at all because the ceramic actually it's laminated usually, and that could start to fall apart because of the heat in the dishwasher. Because that's part of what, like dishwasher at the bakery goes up to 150 degrees. That's really hot for metal, and especially ceramic. So I don't hand wash those. Any other questions? Any other comments? Well, that's what I have for you tonight. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate it. And I hope to see you again soon for our next classes, which I don't remember which our next one is. Do you remember, Aaron?
Actually, I think we need to book some more.
Then we need to book some more classes. But we have classes at the bakery that you can sign up for. They're on my website, thelakehousebakery.com. We have hands-on classes, for everything from French macaron to artisan breads to pie dough to flatbreads is a new one this year. So check out my website for some of the hands-on classes we have at the bakery. Thanks, y'all. And I appreciate your patience tonight. We went a little bit over, but hopefully you learned a lot, and we'll be safe. Awesome. Thanks, guys. Have a good night.